I just want to welcome everyone in here today for our talk with Michelle Bowdler, the author of Is Rape a Crime? Here's my copy of the book, and we have the picture of her, the front. I also want to introduce everyone to Nathaniel Burks, who you may be seeing on screen as well. He's waving right now. He is helping me out here at Beacon Gallery, and we'll be letting people in and out of the chat room. I don't think anyone needs to be let out, but if necessary. And if you have any questions, you can send him a private message, and he'll also be looking for the questions that are for us here, for Michelle or for myself, because we won't necessarily be seeing them. So if you have any questions for us, feel free to put them in the chat, and he can either break in and ask them for us, for you, or he knows that they'll be saved for the end and can help us by asking them and looking at them. So we are going to get started here. We have a nice little group. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about the gallery, and then we'll meet Michelle through a brief bio, talk about how Michelle's book, Is Rape a Crime, is related to our current show at Beacon Gallery, Mixed Messages, then chat with Michelle, and then we'll have a time for Q&A. This will probably all take about an hour, we'll see. So we'll definitely leave about 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. So about 6 to 7 tonight. So for those of you who may not be aware of Beacon Gallery, we're located here in Boston, Massachusetts in the South End, which has its own little art community. We opened back in 2017, and we curate shows with social justice and accessibility in mind. And I myself, Christine O'Donnell, am the person who founded the gallery and run the gallery. Our events are intended to create a sense of community, and we have many upcoming events as well, including a fundraiser for Biden and Harris on the 18th. Another event which is not yet on here, which is going to be on the 19th, which is a event at noon with Diana Weimar and some of her other sewing friends, and then another one with Diana Weimar and Claire Massoud on August 20th. So make sure to keep an eye on our Instagram platform if you want to know more. And now about Michelle Bowdler. Michelle is a recipient of the 2017 Barbara Deming Memorial Award for Nonfiction and has been a fellow at multiple colonies. She's been published in the New York Times and in multiple anthologies and has 2 Pushcart Prize nominated essays. She's worked in public health for years on issues of addiction, violence prevention, sexual health, HIV education and prevention. And she's been also involved working on social justice issues related to rape and crimes of violence. And she's currently the executive director of health and wellness at Tufts University. And she's also the author of this book, which is getting lots of amazing reviews, Is Rape a Crime? A Memoir, an Investigation, and a Manifesto. And this book is out in bookstores now. And our show, Mixed Messages, and this is why we're talking to Michelle today, is a group show that's up until the end of the month. And this is a show that I curated that focuses on rape and sexual violence. We have worked by 6 different artists and collectives that intend to address this issue, although it certainly can't encompass the entire experience. The 6 different, let's say, artists are the Tiny Pricks Project and Diana Weimar, Social Justice Sewing Academy, Rachel Tyne, Jean Sabara Jones, Ibrahim Ali Salam, and Raleigh Straw. All of these people, for the most part, have done artist talks and have Meet the Artists that are available on Beacon Gallery's blog if you'd like to know more. Michelle, I'd love to start by just having you maybe read a brief passage from your book, just to introduce us a bit to the language that you use and for us to just get to hear your voice a bit. And then we can just chat some about your story and the process of writing and your experience.
That sounds great. And I wanted to start by saying thank you, Christine, for putting this together. I'm so excited that you're actually in your beautiful gallery and that we can see a little bit of the exhibit. And the gallery is open, and so anybody in Boston can can go and check it out. And I'm going to try to do that myself. And I'm just thank you for everybody who's listening today. And so I am going to read a short passage from the book. And what I've chosen is in the book, what starts out as the initial trauma and sort of a long time of trying to, get to a place where I could figure out for myself what came next. I started to do some activism work. And through that work and through visiting DC, which I refer to in this section at the Department of Justice, I met many survivors who had looked into their cold cases or had been told by law enforcement that their cases had been solved years and decades after the attack, when old rape kits that had just been pushed aside were tested. And I only knew a little bit about my case, but I had come back with a resolve that I wanted to go to the Boston Sexual Assault Unit and find out more information. So this is a little bit of a passage about right before I did that. And so I hope with that context, this all makes sense. One of the things trauma took from me was the sweetness of the earth, and I longed for the world around me to come alive again. I ached to smell the bread baking in the oven, the soft, sticky wetness under my hands as I kneaded the dough the moment before it went into the loaf pan. To have noticed the fly buzzing around my head, fearing it would wind up in the bread and be mistaken for a raisin. But if someone asked me what I did over the weekend, I would most likely just say, I made bread. Still, going to DC, I remained in contact with my rape friends, as I referred to them, much to Mary's chagrin, and I was getting more of myself back. My mind wandered less, no longer missing half of what was said in a conversation. On one day, my nose had actually noticed the smell of an orange in my hand, its prickly fragrance, and the way it turned the tips of my fingers white after peeling it. Being alive, rather than merely not dead, offered thousands of tiny moments that required attention and held the possibility of joy. There simply wasn't time to wait and ponder what to do while another 25 years flew by. Maybe I'd learn more about my crime, and, a long shot, the rape kit would be found and the case solved. Or maybe none of this would happen, but I would move ahead, learn what I could, and then we'd see. Hope is often a prelude to heartbreak, and yet we persevere. The space where hope resides holds possibility, promise, success, a taste of victory. Maybe this dream I wish for will happen after all. I'll get the job, she'll fall in love with me too. The acceptance letter from the college of my choice is on its way. While we are in the space of waiting, magic is possible, which may be why we wait so very long. I plan to move through this process with the Boston Police Department and draw conclusions later, even though a positive outcome was far from guaranteed.
That's so beautiful. And I love the way you write.
Thank you.
Now, what was there something that originally inspired you to start with the actual writing of a memoir?
I think that's a great question. I had been a writer and had wanted to write and had just begun in college and felt like I was excited by that kind of expression. And after the assault, I really didn't. I really didn't for a very, very long time. And probably about 10 years ago, I started to wonder and think about getting back to writing. I had journaled in the past, and I thought that maybe getting back to writing would help me understand my own response to this trauma in my life. And the memoir originally started out where I was just writing some family stories. I felt like there were so many people in my life, and I started really with my grandmothers in particular, who were both really interesting characters. And I started writing just stories about them and thinking about where did I learn some of these concepts of how you move ahead when so many people that I had met had really struggled. And then a friend of mine who I think is listening tonight told me about Grub Street, which is a writing collective in Boston that's really fantastic. And it's for people who haven't taken a traditional path with an MFA and still love to write and want to learn from some of the best instructors and authors that you could possibly imagine. And so I joined a memoir class, and I was lucky enough to get in. It was a competitive class and it lasted a year. And that's where the memoir really took shape. But that class ended in the spring of 2017, and the book is just coming out now. And so it took another maybe year or year and a half working with my writing group to put it in a form where I was ready to think about even sending it out. And once I did that, I was lucky, and I know this is not everyone's path, but I found an agent, and the book was sold, and so, you know, I guess the message there is that I was very, very lucky, and I felt very fortunate to have that opportunity.
And the book has been receiving a lot of praise. It's been very well received, gotten a lot of good reviews. What's that been like for you?
You know, it's been 2 weeks, and it all feels very strange. I have this sense of unrealness and humility and a little bit of disbelief. It's been especially moving to me when people that I know who know the story a little bit but really don't know much about me as a writer read the book and comment on the writing and sort of how the story was told. And that's been very moving to me. And then once in a while, I feel like a review will describe the book in a way that if I could have wished for what somebody would get out of the book, if you had said, what do you wish somebody would get out of the book? I could like hold some of these reviews up and say, that's what I hoped. And when that happens, it just feels unbelievable.
And it's true that I think that one of the things that people do enjoy about the arts is that kind of ability to move other people or to make them kind of see what the author or the artist is seeing or trying to get them to experience. And was that kind of like your goal here, was to say, this is what I see, this is what I've learned through this process, and I want those of you who read this book to also experience that? Or do you feel like there was a different motivation?
I think that I do want that to happen. And I felt like for some people, I hope, and I believe that they're going to read it and say, this named my experience, and I thought that I was the only person who was ignored by the police, and felt like in some ways that really threw me as much as or in different ways than the actual violence. And it's nice to have that validation, because I feel like this is something that doesn't get talked about enough. There's a perception out there that there are a lot of memoirs about trauma and sexual assault, as if there should only be a limited number, when we seem to have an appetite for unlimited political books and unlimited books about love and grief and magic and all those kinds of things. But when it comes to rape and sexual assault, I think people feel like, hasn't that been told? Some people feel like, hasn't that been told? And the answer to that is no. This is not just a book about my story. It is my story, and I hope that people, that when I say that it resonates with them, I'm sorry if it resonates with them in some ways, but I'm also feel like if it's validating, that's important. And also, I think for some people, and even people who are very politically aware and consider themselves feminists and progressive, they've read some of the data in the book and said, I didn't know some of that, and I feel more outraged than I did, and they appreciate that. And so I'm hoping that can help move us towards some new conversations and change as well.
Often trauma can be a very lonely experience, and so what you've done is you're naming it, as you said, and accompanying it by saying you're not the only one who experiences this. And I do feel like there was this kind of like parallel universe sort of feeling of like, shouldn't we be able to get help from the police when we've experienced something as traumatic as you did? And yet here we were reading in your story that that was not the case. And to find out why at the end, I won't spoil it, was a surprise. So if you don't know, you'll have to read it. You have to read the book and find out.
I think that even when we say that rape is the most underreported crime, one of the reasons that it's underreported, I mean, there's a lot of complex reasons, but some of that is that people they've already decided that there's no point in reporting because the police are not the people they want to go to, and they don't believe they're going to be hurt, or they're afraid for very good reasons to walk into and sit down with law enforcement. And so, the other question is whether the system that we have set up really serves victims and survivors in a way that's actually useful to them, and that we should look at that critically as well.
Well, and that goes to the larger question of like the role of the police force in general, I think, that everyone's asking.
Yes.
Should they be kind of like this universal panacea for every issue that we have in society, or should we be getting more mental health experts out on the streets and probably into whatever the police department maybe should look like in the future?
That's right. And that they are not immune from criticism, that and accountability, and that if it's not working and people aren't feeling served by this process, that it's okay to say that, and that we don't have to be afraid to say that. So I appreciate you, inviting that line of inquiry into this space.
There's so many, I think, different threads that your book kind of pulls in. One thing that I think in this day and age, if we get more onto like the political side, you talked at length about the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill trial. And I thought that was interesting, especially with having seen what happened with Brett Kavanaugh, and also knowing that Kamala Harris was one of the people who questioned him the hardest, and now she's our vice presidential nominee along with Biden. Do you think that things have changed in the last few decades since your experience, or?
I talk in the book, I guess the answer to that is either no or not enough, or not substantially. I mean, I think any of us who are old enough to have actually sat and watched the Thomas hearings will never forget this feeling of just how white and male the panel was, and how dismissive they were, regardless of party. All of them were, and they didn't understand what the stakes were. And I say in the book, it's hard for people to take something seriously when they worry that the behavior that's being described too closely mirrors their own, which might have been part of the problem. And then 27 years later, to have a very similar situation of a credible psychologist talking about the impact of trauma, and that phrase that is in another book that's up on my bookshelf called how trauma, they said, how is it that you can recall things so clearly? And she talks about it being indelible in the hippocampus, and really could actually describe not only what happened to her, but why she waited, why she remembered details. And you juxtapose that to somebody who's up there having a temper tantrum and asking the senators if they had beer, if they liked beer. And what was important to the president of the United States was that there was like, we're going to win, not what's right, not what's best for the country, but that it was framed as somebody's going to win a battle, which is very militaristic anyway, and it doesn't matter what the truth is, and it doesn't matter who's harmed, or the fact that Blasey Ford is continuing to get death threats and can't go back to her home. It's that they won a seat, and with somebody who didn't really, I mean, they truncated the testimony of witnesses so that they couldn't get the information. And it can be very discouraging for people who, who ask themselves, when will anything ever change, and what will it take?
I think that's the problem, is that there doesn't feel, and that's one of the things I think that inspired the show, is that it feels like there's no amount of attention that has gotten us to a point, and not that the show is going to give it that attention, but I feel like it's like every little drop, right? Like your book, this show, that new show that's on HBO. The name is escaping me at the moment, but like all of these things you hope will kind of create this movement towards, kind of similar to how Me Too also pushed, I think, things forward a little bit, that eventually there's going to be some sort of real accountability in our society, and a movement away from what you called towards the end of the book, rape culture.
And what I also talked about in the book, and what I think is true, is that anytime any of us listening and in our own experiences can talk about examples where the littlest progress on this issue is immediately thwarted. I think I quoted something that was in Forbes magazine where women were having trouble getting hired in certain jobs, right, in the financial district, if they were perceived as attractive, or if it was perceived that perhaps somebody might accuse, not that it was happening, but that people would be accused of assault. And that Trump would say, it's a dangerous time for men in America, or that, I work in a college. And I'll tell you, nobody seemed to mind when it was the victims who reported assaults, weren't believed by deans, had to leave school because there were no consequences for the perpetrator and it was too traumatizing for them. And they complained and they complained and they complained, and no one seemed to care. And as soon as in 2009 or 11, when Obama put out these guidelines for colleges that were meant to do a better job to at least make things more fair, and immediately people started complaining that it was now unfair for the young men accused of sexual assault. And I think anytime that happens, people have to ask themselves, what are we seeing here? We're seeing misogyny. I'll just answer for myself. Misogyny and patriarchy. We're seeing that it's okay if people who are marginalized by their gender, race, age, or gender identity are harmed in any particular way. But if we want to hold people in power accountable, watch out. And that is, we have to name it, and we have to work to change it. It's too pervasive, and it's not acceptable by any means.
I also thought immediately when I was reading some of this about how there's maybe been like one case that I've heard of in, let's say, the last 10 years of a woman maybe wrongly accusing someone of rape. And it becomes like national news and everyone wants to talk about it, right? Because it's like these poor men have become these victims of this woman who just, was out for revenge or something like that. And I couldn't help but think that of all the women who have actually been assaulted, who we won't give that level of attention to, whose lives are being ruined, and just that complete disproportionality.
Excellent point. And that's a perfect example where we don't even really know what happened in some of these cases that were deemed untrue, like the case at Duke, or there was some other, and it becomes front page news, and it is meant to discredit every victim and survivor. It is not, and because of the thrill and the excitement and the retweets and the story after story after story about this one case, and a person is raped like every 73 seconds in our country. And so how is it that that's of such interest to reporters? Really, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's I completely agree, and I just found myself thinking to I thought of that multiple times, and just
Yeah.
made me angry, along with a lot of other things that I read in your book. Um, One of the things I think a lot of people find themselves doing a double take on with your book, or that might kind of cause some emotion, is the title of your book, Is Rape a Crime? Do you want to talk a little bit about what's behind that? Because I know that for some people, let's say like my 8-year-old was like, is rape a crime? Like he didn't understand what was happening there because he wanted to take it literally. But
Yes.
why don't you describe a little bit of what's actually behind it?
Well, I'm glad you asked me. I actually had a rant about this today for an essay that I'm writing called "When Your Memoir Has the Word Rape in Its Title," and I thought about calling it "When Your Life it Needs a Trigger Warning." So those are my two working titles. So here's the thing: it's a real question. It's a real question. And it was a question, as you know, because you read the book, that somebody asked me. And I'm going to be a little, yeah, there it is. So I'm going to be a little detailed here, and I'm not giving a trigger warning. I'm going to say I'm going to be a little bit detailed here. I was at an event that a nonprofit put together, and I was sitting with a woman who, her story involved, she was abducted and held over multiple days by someone who was a serial rapist, and he preyed on people who were young enough that he knew that police would immediately disregard them, like 16, 17, 18 to 20, 25. And so her rape kit was languished in a city that, when they discovered their backlog of rape kits going back for quite a while, and her assault occurred at a time when the CODIS system, which can put DNA into a national database, existed, like the early 2000s. And they just never investigated her case, and they never did anything with it. And they didn't take responsibility for those 12,000 untested kits and denied that they had a problem in their city. So we were beginning to feel really dissatisfied with some of these nonprofits who wanted us to go to these events and give them advice on how to address this, I keep saying backlog, but it was basically police don't investigate rape and they put the evidence in a warehouse and forget about it. And so she looked at me, she said to me, you really have to ask yourself if rape is considered a crime. It wasn't that they tried and didn't solve it. They didn't even bother to think about it for a second. And when she asked me that question, it really struck a nerve for me. And it was a very powerful question. And when I wrote the book proposal and I talked to some people about, I had a poem at the start of the book, and the book was called The Idea of Order. To sort of imply that you think things are better, but they're really not. Nobody knew what it meant. And so we needed something that would make more sense. And that was the title that we set on. And I guess what I would say is that when people are offended by the title, I would sort of switch that question to say, you know what, I don't mind you being outraged about the title, but I really wish you were outraged by what's inside the book. And that you take the time to wonder why a long-term survivor and somebody who's been active in this work for a very long time would think that that's a reasonable question to ask. And I think the question gets answered very quickly in the book. And so it wasn't to be cheeky, it wasn't to be sensationalistic, it wasn't to sell books. It was actually a plea to say, we have such a problem here. This is the only way I can think of to get your attention, to say we have a problem here, that basically rape is not addressed in any serious way in our society and it has to stop.
Thank you for sharing that. That was really, I think, enlightening for a lot of people, and very eloquently put. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Um, did it feel, I know you mentioned at one point in your book that it felt like a Faustian bargain to have to talk about your own trauma to shed light on the issue of sexual violence. Does was that just in reference to having to work with the nonprofits, or is that something that you feel is the case kind of more so across the board?
Yeah, no, it was really specific to working with organizations that what I realized early on, because I actually worked in this field doing this work at a college campus. And when I was in the space of survivor at these nonprofits, I felt like sometimes there was a metaphorical tap on the head. Like, we would be told to tell our stories to a room full of DAs, or, when we were at the Department of Justice, we were supposed to tell our stories so that people could understand the impact of what it feels like to have somebody knock on your door 20 years later and say, oh, we solved your case. We could have solved it, but we didn't. But, well, they don't say that. And when I said things like, well, instead of asking us how you're going to tell people, why don't you have a press conference and say you're really sorry, and you're gonna actually go through and figure out how that happened, and you're gonna hold people accountable, and you're gonna probably fire some people. And they looked at me like, you're just supposed to tell your story. Like, just tell your rape story and cry a little bit, and then we'll figure out the rest of the policy stuff. My degree is in policy. So I never felt like they actually wanted to hear from us about change and about anger. They just wanted us to tell our story and move off so that they could then move forward. And that's why I felt like a Faustian bargain. And, and the way I talk about these women who had HBO specials and Lifetime series and true crime cable TV shows about their horrifying stories. And I think they all felt like they were doing it to spread the word. But it comes out of your hide. It really does. And so that's what I meant. I meant specifically with them. And I made very intentional choices in my book about when I was going to be explicit. And part of the reason I was as explicit as I was is because I felt like people don't express it. They don't talk about it. And so it allows people who want to minimize it to frame it as something other than a devastating crime of violence that has long-lasting effects. So
I feel like I'm still processing everything that you said there. Do you, given your policy work and your work at Tufts, do you see like a way forward for the Boston police or for your school? And you're like, there are 3 things that I would like to see be done.
Yes, I do. First of all, in every talk that I've given, when people ask me one thing that I think that they can do, it's vote. 30 to 40% of people in our country don't vote. And they don't vote often because there's one thing about a candidate that really annoys them, or they don't feel it'll make a difference, or they don't have the time because they're working a 12-hour day, and we don't make it easy for people to vote in this country. But until we have people who actually represent more of what our country actually looks like, and the range of experiences that people who are not traditionally now in positions of power experience, there isn't going to be the kind of change that we need. I really also want to thank all the people who've been out protesting systemic racism and putting their lives and bodies on the line to try to make a difference in that regard. And I know how hard it's been for people to do that in the middle of a pandemic. And it just, it really shows you that, people's ability to feel like they can sit back any longer is changing. But it has taken such pain and such suffering to even get to where we are, and also to have an administration that we feel is just so outrageously oppressive. So I'm not going to hide my politics. It makes no sense. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is to begin to talk about crimes of violence and this book and about the ways in which it is unacceptable the way we currently accept the norms for how rape is adjudicated, how it's reported, what the requirements are. And sometimes even a little thing will make a difference. And I can give you an example if you say three things. So every state in our country, so the Violence Against Women Act was passed, I think, in 1994. And it requires that every state has a victim compensation fund. Well, the Victim Compensation Fund currently, in most states, you have to produce a police report to prove that you didn't just show up because you wanted money, which who would do that anyway? But there's a belief that you have to somehow, raise the bar to say, well, no, I got a rape kit done and I went to the police, so now I can get money for groceries and rent and therapy because I'm having trouble working, and I need this. I need to be able to, take my kids out of an abusive situation or whatever it is. I believe that that's something that should change, and that somebody else can attest to somebody's trauma, like a therapist or a family member, and that we don't have to require reporting for something that's so essential for people after trauma. So, that's working at a state level to make change. Introduce a bill, call your legislator, and those are two concrete things. And to not necessarily look towards law enforcement to solve this issue. If we are going to continue to have a system where law enforcement is going to stay involved, we have to require training. We have to make sure that police officers are more diverse, and that the training is not training by police officers, but it is by somebody like myself, or people who work at BARC, who can get up and say, this is really the issue here and this is the problem. I can't tell you how many times I offered the lead detective of the sexual assault unit in Boston when he's like, yeah, I train people. I train the police on sexual assault misconduct. I'm like, why don't you take me with you? And he's like, yeah, I'll think about that. And 6 or 7 years later, that's never happened. And you have to ask yourself why. That I think if they heard directly, it would be very, very powerful for them.
I want to make sure that we have time in case, I have tons of other things I could ask, but I want to make sure we have time in case there are people with questions, that we can see those. I'm going to try to pull up the chat, but Nathaniel, also, if you've been seeing any questions coming through. I can also invite people, if you'd like to unmute yourselves, to ask a question.
Yeah, or you can write it in the chat.
Yeah, write it in the chat.
Yeah.
Or whatever kind of works for you. But anyone who'd like to contribute or ask a question directly to Michelle, I want to give you an opportunity to do that. I know I'll say one more thing as we're going. I have two little boys, two little white boys, and I'm feeling like this huge responsibility to kind of hopefully create a new generation that's not going to, let's say, their father's wonderful, but it's just like we exist as this already kind of formed generation, but I feel this responsibility to kind of grow this new generation that will hopefully be better than ours. And it's a challenge and an ask, and not always easy, but I'm working on it.
I appreciate you saying that, and I have to say that not only do I work at Tufts, but one of my kids went to Tufts. My son, my older, and they do all kinds of sexual assault and all kinds of training and programming for students. And how, he would often say to me when I would grab him and give him a kiss, and he's like, Mom, absence of no is not consent. And I'd be like, that's right, then I am sorry, may I hug you? And he would say, yes, you may. And we weren't really joking. It was sort of like, he had learned a concept that was really important, that I felt like it's such a beautiful, easy sentence. Absence of no is not consent. You have to have clear, explicit consent when proceeding with, sexual behavior. And I every time he said it, I would actually feel so heartened. And I believe there is hope. I have a lot of hope in our generation, not mine, in my kids' generation, and I really respect them and what they do.
Yeah, I'm hoping to see good things coming out of the future as well. We're still working on, with a 6 and an 8-year-old, let's say, like, no means no, and hands off each other, and
Yeah.
stop punching and stuff like that. But it's never too young to kind of like start with the concepts, and you got to build up to the absence of no is not consent. How did it go again?
The absence of no is not consent.
The absence of no is not consent. I do love it.
Yeah.
Nathaniel has said in the chat that everyone is allowed to unmute themselves. So if anyone would like to say something, please feel free.
It's okay if people feel shy. We can go with one more question from you, and then,
Yeah. We can just leave it like that. Oh, here's something that's coming in. I can just read it.
Shall judicial opinions after trial omit details of rape that has no legal relevance to avoid privacy issues, I assume? Yes, to avoid victim re-traumatization. Yeah, I think, okay, so that's a great question. And I would say that question also is relevant to some of the things that I'd like to see changed. Apparently, I didn't know this, but when somebody goes forward with a complaint, and the police, in a rare instance, and the DAs decide to move forward in a rape trial, the state is actually the defendant, not the victim. So it is the state who is bringing charges against the perpetrator, the accused. And so sometimes it can feel to people like they lose all control of what's happening. And so I don't think there's any reason to, even if somebody's identity is hidden, as we know, there are so many details that can identify somebody, that I do think that people should be mindful about what details get put forward, because in many instances, victims aren't safe if those details come out. We know that 30 to 40% of people are victimized before the age of 18. They're often victimized by somebody in power in their family or in their community, who is often beloved because that's part of the way that they insinuate themselves into sports teams and coach. I mean, coach. I'm not saying every coach, but it's often somebody who is so beloved that it's intimidating for people to put things forward, and by strategy, I'd say. So I think that is important, if it's possible, to try to get that to change, so that it isn't necessarily just the victim's identity or survivor, if they prefer that term, but also the details of the trial that can also dissuade them from wanting to move forward and also not feel safe afterwards. Being asked, I love your politics. Thank you for it all. Has it been talking about your experience, and do you find that more people are coming up to you to share their own stories that have been silent for so long? Yes. And in fact, that happened to me before I even wrote the book. When I started to tell people what happened, or I had something published, my story was in the Boston Globe, and it was amazing how many people wrote to me and said, people I had known for a long time, like with an email, they never told anybody this, and they're going to tell me this, because they felt that they could, that they would feel understood in a particular way. And some people are disclosing, but not a lot, like, thank you for writing this. This is meaningful to me. And it hasn't been it hasn't been painful. It hasn't been difficult. It's actually not overwhelming. And I guess I had to wait till I was ready to know that it wouldn't be overwhelming in order for that to be okay. And it really has been.
I've been looking forward to this conversation. I was raped when I was 12 in New York. And so all of the kinds of responses or lack of them that you were talking about in terms of the police and the judicial system, I was kind of spared in a funny way. The police, let's see, how do I say this? At that time, I thought, and I actually still do in hindsight, thought that they were doing a good job. They took me seriously. I never felt that they were not believing me. They did a lot to try and help me without letting anybody see me, actually look through a peephole to try and identify the man who raped me. And I never was able to do that. I learned years later that he was caught because he was raping a lot of kids as well as adults. And he was sentenced, I guess, to 40 years. And of course, what did I think when I learned that was that I better be on the lookout in 40 years. I figured out my age in 40 years, where I might be living, and I was scared he was going to find me. Of course, that never happened. But I did find the police to be serious.
Yeah.
Nobody helped me there because they certainly didn't know really how to.
Yeah.
My parents really were not helpful. They were terrified and scared of the publicity that might get out. It was 18 years, and I was in Boston at the time, and I was 30, that I took all of my courage and decided to come forward and talk to people about this. It took me 18 years to not feel like it was my fault.
Yeah.
Right, of course. And so anyway, I went to something then in Cambridge called the Rape Crisis Center. I don't know if it's still the same race. Okay. I actually donated some money to it, hoping that it was still the same. It helped me a great deal. It was just conversation, and it helped me a great deal because I was so cut off and felt so guilty.
Yeah.
And so I'm now 73. All right. Wow. You got that? 73.
Awesome.
And I'm functional and okay, but it's never left me. Not for a minute.
Thank you for feeling like you could share that with us, and for speaking directly to us. And I really feel that was a lot, and I really appreciate it. I guess what I want to say a couple things back to you is that I'm glad to hear the police treated you well. I'm so if that could happen more often, that would be very important. And also that I'm really sorry that happened. And I'm also glad that you could tell us that you still felt impacted, and that is a normal. In the book, my spouse says, "You're not crazy. What happened to you is crazy." And for so many of us who have a response over a lifetime, it's really important that we understand that there are some things you don't get over. You may live side by side with it, but it's something that changes you, and that colors your childhood, or changes how you think about, like, to feel like something was your fault at that age, is so sad, but it's also not uncommon. And so I just want to thank you for sharing, and And I hope this talk was helpful and relevant to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
We have another person who would like to ask a question or make a comment.
Hi.
I'm a family member and I adore this woman, love her like I can't even tell you how much. And I just want to tell her that when we first found out, we all got the phone call. We happened to be in the same house we were all visiting together and nobody could talk. We just cried and didn't know how to feel. I think I was heartbroken. My heart just was broken for her. And I don't even remember years later, when was the first time I talked to you, Mish, to tell you how sorry I was because we didn't talk to you at the beginning because you just needed some space.
Yeah.
And I just heartbroken. We were not that it's us. This was not on us. I mean, it's not about us. It's about you. But our hearts were broken for you, just broken. And we didn't know how to proceed. I hope this book has given you some peace, some satisfaction, and helped you lift whatever devils were living there.
Well, it has. And I also want to say that response is not uncommon either. I think that that part of what I hope changes with this book is that by sort of just really in whatever raw terms, like this is how I felt, this is what happened, this is, the ways in which different people responded is just describing human behavior in overwhelming circumstances. And I think we all wonder how we would respond to something that's completely overwhelming and horrific. And there really isn't a right or a wrong way. We all figure it out. And I think that, the fact that my family has been so supportive and loving through this whole process and has really been very meaningful to me. So thank you.
You're welcome, Mish. I love you.
Love you too.
Goodness, thank you. This has been so lovely to get all these questions and comments. We're coming up upon the hour mark. Is there one last comment or question that anyone would like to make? Or if not, we can wrap it up here. I'll just give a second to see.
Hi, I didn't get in a timely fashion, so I hope I'm not repeating anything that's already been said, but I did meet Christine a few days ago and she spoke to me about this and invited me to join Michelle, and I haven't read your book, but I too was a victim, as I guess most on this line or most that support victims. I testified in criminal court for 2.5 years. The fellow that raped me was on probation for rape, and he was convicted in a violation of probation hearing as well as the trial and sentenced in both. But I found out many years later that he was released from prison after doing little or no time. And that was my trouble with this after going through all of this, and then, offering so many years of my life afterward in and through the symptoms and that I endured and everything else, because it wasn't a quick thing with me. It went on for hours, many hours. And so I wondered how you felt about that, and what kind of solution there might be to, keeping someone in jail who has done, and it has been proved that has done this, something like this to a human being.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it was really challenging writing this book in a time when the issues of over-incarceration have become so, one of the major issues that people are talking about related to progressive change. And part of that is that the people who are incarcerated are often incarcerated for minor drug crimes, petty theft. And so when people talk about being, it's hard to think about, that for some people when we're the most when we put so many people in jail in our country, often who have committed these petty crimes. These are not petty crimes. These are felony crimes. And it is mind-boggling to me when we also know that most rapists who are caught are often caught because they're serial rapists, and they do it so many times that eventually they're discovered through any, whether it's through the DNA database or some other means. And so I do think that it's problematic that somebody who commits a violent felony, which in some cases, qualifies almost as attempted murder, that and home invasion, which is in and of itself a major felony that can have life imprisonment associated with it in some states. It's almost like if I had reported home invasion rather than rape, they might have taken it more seriously, and we shouldn't have to feel that way. So I don't have a good answer for you except to say that I'm really sorry that that happened, and they should have informed you and talked about a victim impact before they just let somebody out as if it would be of no concern to the person who was harmed, and that's just wrong. And there's no two ways about it. So thank you for sharing that, and I'd like to see change in that as well.
Well, thank you so much. I think here we are at 7 o'clock, so I think we'll probably leave it there before we exhaust you too much further. This has been really lovely. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you all to those of you who listened, participated, asked questions. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you all did too. And for those of you who want to learn more, the book is out. The book is available. I recommend you read it. So it may seem from this conversation that it's intense, and there are moments that are intense, but it's actually a really informative, well-written, excellent book. And so I highly recommend it.
And so thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. You had great questions, and thank you for all the people who listened in and contributed. I really appreciate it. And I'm doing other events and have some things coming up, and it's all very exciting, but it's also just very meaningful to me to have people take the time to think about these issues and listen in, and I really, really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. I'll let you all kind of leave the chat as you're ready, and have a good evening to all. Thank you again for participating.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.